Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ronald Gill. I'm a graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences in 1981, and I am a proud father of a daughter who also graduated from the college. I'm here today in my capacity as a member of the College of Arts and Sciences Dean Advisory Board. I want to welcome you here today. Today's A&S Alumni Academy Arts and Sciences offers these Zoom talks as a way of letting alumni know of the great research and scholarship happening at the college. Today, we are pleased to present Monsters in the Movie Lab, the longevity of Hollywood's classic monsters. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to share with you. First, we ask everyone mute their phones, mute their microphones. This will ensure that everyone can hear our presenter. If you do not if you do not want the image recorded, please feel free to turn off your camera. We are recording the event, and it will be shared on the college's website for people to view after this evening. Closed captioning services are provided for the event. At this time, please direct your attention to the chat for additional instructions on closed captions and other informational items. Right now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Will Scheibel is an associate professor in the Department of English, where he teaches in the Film and Screen Studies track. Professor Scheibel teaches and writings focus on popular narrative cinema from the United States, with particular attention to Hollywood stars, styles, genres, and production trends between the 1930s and 1960s, or, as is better known, the classical studio period. He is currently working on a new book called Monsters in the Lab, Horror, Seriality, and Universal Pictures. So we'll be hearing a bit about this research in this afternoon's presentation. I am very excited today for today's conversations. And so with that, I will turn over the program to Professor Scheibel.
Thanks, Ron. And I want to thank Liz for inviting me, and Ron and Becca for facilitating the presentation and the discussion. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Ron, if you want to give me just a thumbs up if you can hear me and see the PowerPoint.
That's great. I can hear you and I see you well.
Perfect. All right. Thanks again. So as Ron said, my name is Will Scheibel. I'm looking forward to the Q&A afterwards. We'll have about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for discussion. And I teach in the English department. We have a film and screen studies track in the English department, so students can take classes on film and television and games specifically, and those classes count towards the English and textual studies major. I teach a class on monster movies. I'm also working on a book about the Universal Pictures monster movies, and that's where this presentation comes from. I'm currently on leave, and so I've been kind of furiously researching and writing, so you're getting this fresh in my mind. All right, so I'll go ahead and start things off here. After the commercial disappointment and critical lambasting of its 2017 version of The Mummy, Universal Pictures abandoned plans for resurrecting its old monster movies with a series that exists in a shared story world similar to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and gave its so-called Dark Universe a premature burial. Beginning with The Invisible Man, and that's the 2020 film, of course, the studio has forged ahead with standalone films featuring iconic monster characters. The horror comedy Renfield, starring Nicolas Cage as Count Dracula, who's the master of the title character. That film was released last spring, while a Dracula origin story called The Last Voyage of the Demeter set sail this past summer. Looking ahead...
Well, to interrupt you shortly. Now, you mentioned earlier you had some graphics.
Yes, yeah. Can you all see that?
No, they're not up as of yet.
So on my end...
I can actually see them just fine, thanks.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Okay, great. All right, yeah, please just stop me if for some reason you're not seeing anything, but hopefully everybody's seeing just like a gray background with two movie posters. So Last Voyage of the Demeter came out this summer. Maybe some of you remember seeing the previews for that. Maybe some of you saw it. Looking ahead, a remake of The Bride of Frankenstein is scheduled to begin shooting early next year under the direction of Maggie Gyllenhaal. And a science fiction Western reimagining of Dracula is in development with writer, director, producer Chloe Zhao. In one way, we can understand the long afterlives of these pre-sold properties in terms of the economics of Hollywood genres. Universal created a brand identity in the studio system with the horror film, a newly recognized production trend in the early 1930s that, as Kyle Edwards has argued, became synonymous with the studio through its corporate strategy at the time. Universal was the house of horrors. Yet what would become the Universal Classic Monsters, or UCM, was not a genre in itself, but existed within horror of the 1930s as a cycle. Amanda Ann Klein defines a film cycle as, quote, a series of films associated with each other through shared images, characters, settings, plots, or themes, unquote. And she explains that, quote, the formation and longevity of film cycles are direct results of their immediate financial viability, as well as the public discourses circulating around them, including film reviews, director interviews, studio-issued press kits, movie posters, theatrical trailers, and media coverage, unquote. The cycle of A-budget monster movies at Universal began in 1931 with the highly successful Dracula and Frankenstein, and continued with The Mummy, 1932, The Invisible Man, 1933, The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, and Werewolf of London, 1935. Following the Dracula sequel, Dracula's Daughter, 1936, a third Frankenstein film was scheduled to move into production, but when Charles Rogers succeeded Carl Laemmle Jr. as the studio's head of production, he put a moratorium on monster movies. At a time when Hollywood was investing in so-called prestige pictures and the Production Code Administration, or the PCA, was cracking down on sex and violence, the puritanical Joseph Breen took office in 1934, the monster movie had acquired a status of cultural disrepute, one it arguably still retains. For whatever monster movies may have lacked in cultural value, they made up for by proving their continued economic worth after the Regina Wilshire Theater in Los Angeles scored a box office hit in 1938 with programming Dracula, Frankenstein, and RKO's Son of Kong, 1933, on a triple bill. Universal responded by re-releasing Dracula and Frankenstein on a double bill nationwide, sending Dracula star Bela Lugosi on tour to promote the event with personal appearances. Production of A-budget horror at the studio resumed with a second wave of monster movies that created a family tree of sorts. Son of Frankenstein, 1939, and the alternate continuity Dracula sequel, Son of Dracula, 1943. The Invisible Man Returns, 1940, centering on the brother of the first monster. A new werewolf film, The Wolfman, 1941, which shared no connection to Universal's earlier Werewolf of London, and the first three-strip Technicolor horror film for Universal, The Phantom of the Opera, 1943, a remake of the studio's 1925 film starring Lon Chaney Sr., which we can view as a precursor to the monster-based horror of the 1930s and 1940s. Universal's monsters became synonymous with stars under contract at the studio. Boris Karloff played both the mummy Imhotep and Frankenstein's monster. He would reprise the latter role in Bride and Son. Claude Rains played Invisible Man Jack Griffin, and Lon Chaney Jr. played the 1941 Wolfman Larry Talbot. When Rains succeeded Chaney Sr. as the Phantom, he introduced the character's most recognizable look on screen with a masquerade-style costume, black cloak, wide-brimmed hat, and gray half-faced base mask. Seriality ruled the day for Universal's monster cycle in the 1940s, although most of the subsequent productions were at the B level. Not surprisingly, given how sequels are often judged as inferior imitations of an original text, the product of crass commercialism, This period also represents the nadir in critical evaluations of Universal's horror output. There were 3 additional sequels to The Invisible Man featuring different invisible characters: The Invisible Woman, 1940, Invisible Agent, 1942, and The Invisible Man's Revenge, 1944. Frankenstein received yet another sequel with The Ghost of Frankenstein, 1942. Previously distinct storylines intersected with crossover films, suggesting that Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and Dracula resided in the same fictional universe. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, 1943, picked up where both the Wolfman and the Ghost of Frankenstein left off, and House of Frankenstein, 1944, and House of Dracula, 1945, followed in this narrative continuity, incorporating Dracula into the monster mashup. Even the Mummy reemerged in the 1940s, not as Imhotep, the character with the fez and wrinkled skin whom Karloff immortalized in the 1932 film, but as Charis, whose lumbering gait and bandaged appearance gave us the popular image of the classic movie Mummy we have today. Charis debuted in The Mummy's Hands, 1940, and returned for The Mummy's Tomb, 1942, The Mummy's Ghost, 1944, and The Mummy's Curse, also 1944. Finally, Universal participated in the 1940s trend of female-centered monster movies with a trilogy of ape woman films: Captive Wild Woman, 1943, Jungle Woman, 1944, and Jungle Captive, 1945, and an in-name only sequel to Werewolf of London titled She-Wolf of London. The second wave of monster movies might slot one actor into different roles across a series, problematizing the synthesis of star and character that the first wave established. For example, in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, John Carradine took over the role of Dracula from Lugosi, and Glenn Strange played Frankenstein's monster, while Karloff returned in House of Frankenstein as a Frankensteinian mad scientist. In Son of Frankenstein and The Ghost of Frankenstein, Lugosi played the monster's sidekick, Igor, a blacksmith left with a twisted spine after surviving a hangman's noose. The character is commonly confused with Dwight Frye's hunchbacked laboratory assistant Fritz in the original Frankenstein. Lugosi also appeared as the Romani fortune teller who passed lycanthropy onto Larry Talbot in The Wolfman, and in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, he starred opposite Chaney Jr. to play Frankenstein's monster, who was then carrying Igor's brain, of course. Even Universal's monster mainstay, Chaney Jr., the only actor to play Larry Talbot in the studio era, moved from monster to monster, from The Ghost of Frankenstein to Son of Dracula, while replacing Tom Tyler after the first Charis Mummy film. No matter, the presence of these recurring stars identified their films with Universal's honored tradition in screen horror. Two of the studio's most productive series at the time occupy a curious place in the history of Universal horror: the Sherlock Holmes films and the Inner Sanctum mysteries. From 1942 to 1946, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce starred as Holmes and Dr. Watson, respectively, in 12 films that updated Arthur Conan Doyle's detective stories to the contemporary period. The Inner Sanctum mysteries, comprised of 6 films starring Lon Chaney Jr., released between 1943 and 1945, that Universal produced by arrangement with Simon & Schuster, which had already licensed its Inner Sanctum mystery novels for radio adaptation to great success. The films merely bore the imprint. As Mark Jankovich's research has shown, the terms mystery and thriller were used synonymously with horror in the 1940s. While mystery has since become a generic label for puzzle-solving films, it then, quote, was concerned with the strange, uncanny, and mysterious, unquote. If thriller now suggests, quote, realist dramas of crime or espionage, the thriller in the 1940s was directly associated with the chiller, and the terms thrills and chills were often used together as a combination term rather than as 2 separate terms, unquote. In other words, quote, the thriller was a film targeted at the thrill seeker, and the films identified as such were supposed to be terrifying, hair-raising, and or spine-tingling. They were also supposed to make one's flesh creep or induce goose pimples, unquote. In the case of Sherlock Holmes and Inner Sanctum, what has changed is not so much the generic terminology. The Sherlock Holmes and Inner Sanctum films would still be categorized as mysteries or thrillers today. but the definition of terms. Mystery and thriller no longer suggest the same experience as horror. So porous were these boundaries in the 1940s that two of Universal's Sherlock Holmes films, The Spider-Woman, 1943, and The Pearl of Death, 1944, inspired monster movie spin-offs. The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, 1946, has no canonical relation to the Holmes film, but served as another vehicle for Gail Sondergaard to play the villain, while acromegalytic character actor Rondo Hatton from The Pearl of Death was able to reprise his role as the Creeper in House of Horrors, 1946. Universal even rushed a prequel to House of Horrors into production called The Brute Man, 1946, again with Hatton as the Creeper. But the studio was on the cusp of merging with International Pictures and ceasing B-film productions, and the film was instead released by the Poverty Row Studio Producers Releasing Corporation just before Hatton's death. This brief historical narrative raises several questions about the formation of the UCM and its impact on popular culture. How were Universal's monster movies of the 1930s and 1940s bracketed from the wider crop of films that were then considered part of horror? Why do Universal's monsters remain culturally visible and recognizable as icons? What explains their ongoing popularity? When and how did the monsters of Universal Pictures become classics? And what counts as a classic monster anyway? Undergraduates in my film history classes are likely to be already aware of the UCM without even having seen any of the constitutive films, but there's no guarantee that a contemporaneous film cycle from the Hollywood studio system, say Busby Berkeley's backstage musicals for Warner Brothers, would register the same familiarity despite its own historical popularity. To be sure, monster movies in general and Universal's monster cycle in particular have been the subjects of a substantial body of literature. Scholars tend to approach these films in at least one of three ways. One, through a narrative history of their making at a single moment in time, i.e. the Hollywood studio era. Two, through thematic or symptomatic interpretations of what the monsters represent or reflect, often heavily informed by theory or philosophy. And three, through value judgments that explain what makes them great or paradigmatic works in the horror genre, asserting and reinforcing their so-called classic status while taking their popularity as a given. Where my project differs is in its reliance less on the films themselves as primary sources than on their paratexts, what Jonathan Gray, following the literary theorist Gerard Genette, defines as the material that surrounds a text and grants us different points of access to it. Gray writes, quote, "Paratexts tell us what to expect, and in doing so, they shape the reading strategies that we will take with us into the text, and they provide the all-important early frames through which we will examine, react to, and evaluate textual consumption," unquote. Rather than undertaking a project of textual analysis to make claims about the meaning of Universal's monsters, I argue that paratexts, sequels, parodies, television syndication packaging, fan magazines and collectibles, home video releases, theme park attractions, remakes, and spin-offs have made it possible for the studio to continue resurrecting its back catalog of movie monsters and retrofit them into a multimedia entertainment franchise. Tracking how Universal has used its monsters and to what ends is a way of examining the cultural forces that reanimate old texts, keep them alive in the public imagination, and afford them different identities over time, rather than leaving them chained to the dark recesses of the past. First and foremost, paratexts have identified Universal's monsters as worthy of notoriety. I agree with Gray's thesis that, quote, paratexts are not simply add-ons, spin-offs, and also rans. They create texts, they manage them, and they fill them with many of the meanings we associate with them, unquote. Here, they have influenced audience understandings of films such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man as part of a distinct cycle within horror, monster movies, as signature products of a particular studio, Universal Pictures, and eventually as a canon that supports a studio legacy, the UCM. By 1948, only 2 years after the release of its last Gothic horror film, the studio had adopted a new attitude to the genre by pairing its popular comedy duo Bud Abbott and Lou Costello with The Wolfman, Chaney Jr., Dracula, Lugosi, and Frankenstein's monster, Strange, in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, 1948. Abbott and Costello then met an invisible middleweight boxer, played by Arthur Franz, in Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, 1951, and a mummy named Clarice, played by Eddie Parker, presumably a deliberate misnaming of Charis for comic effect, in Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, 1955. On the one hand, the Abbott and Costello Meet the Monsters films mark an official endpoint of Universal's monster cycle in the studio era, but on the other hand, they serve a paratextual function in contributing to the afterlife of its monster horror movies. As James Naramore has persuasively argued, quote, even when parody ridicules a style, it feeds on what it imitates, unquote. He explains that, quote, like analytic criticism, parody helps define and even create certain styles, giving them visibility and status, unquote. In other words, quote, scholars and mimics also preserve what they destroy, transforming it into an idea that can be revived by later critics, unquote. The Abbott and Costello Meet the Monsters films helped to distinguish the major monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and the Invisible Man, from the minor. At the same time, they reinforced the formula's narrative conventions and visual iconography by acknowledging them as the subjects of ridicule. Universal even included these films in the 2018 Blu-ray release of the Universal Classic Monsters Complete 30 Film Collection, suggesting they are now part of canon. The industrial practice of building blockbuster franchises around intellectual properties, or IPs, has been par for the course in Hollywood since the 1970s, as early as Jaws, Star Wars, and Superman, and as recent as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Whether Universal's monster cycle is an early example of a film franchise, though, is a difficult question to answer. Media franchises entail the exploitation of an intellectual property across multiple cultural texts and consumer products, writes Daniel Herbert, from movies and video games to backpacks and toy jewelry. Franchises are cultural texts whose intertextual linkages have been made by industrial design, with the aim to expand and spread the same property as far and wide as possible. And that's all Daniel Herbert, whom I'm quoting. Yet Derek Johnson points out that, quote, the language of franchising would not come to be deployed in even the retail industries until 1959, despite the pre-existence of the economic practices and relationships that would come to be known as franchising, unquote. To call Universal's monster cycle a franchise, then, would be to invoke the discourse of, quote, a far more recent phenomenon that can work to reframe historical practice, unquote, and, quote, to read back onto it an anachronistic cultural logic, unquote. By contrast, William Proctor refers to Universal's monster movies from the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s, the period dominated by sequels and crossover storylines, as the franchise cycle. According to Proctor, quote, Universal pioneered the idea that the film series could work more like serials by experimenting with transfictional storytelling, unquote, and began, quote, building horror worlds by utilizing continuity logics adopted and adapted from serial entertainments of the time, unquote, including serial fiction, film and radio serials, and comic strips. For my purposes, I'm neither concerned with making the case that the Universal monster cycle was or was not a franchise, but rather to propose that the discursive and industrial conditions of these films were such that the studio was successfully able to retrofit it into a franchise. This process occurred and continues to occur through what Barbara Klinger calls post-premiere circulation, otherwise known as the aftermarket. Quote, the most influential circuit of continued public visibility, representing a mode of textual existence that surpasses the financial motivations behind a re-release to shape a title's meaning, aesthetics, and place in the canon, unquote. Aftermarkets, she goes on to explain, quote, provide the conditions necessary for films to become memorable or to be forgotten, to rise or fall in canonical rank, to find or lose audiences, to persist in or disappear from the mediascape, unquote. Following Klinger's methodology, we cannot assume that a film earns its canonicity by possessing intrinsic aesthetic value that the correct reading strategy will be able to access both at the time of its theatrical release and long after, making it, to coin a phrase, a timeless classic. Instead, their canonicity depends on the aesthetics of circulation. That's Klinger's term, what she defines as, quote, the architectures of transformation that refashion films according to the requirements of new exhibition contexts over time, unquote. Klinger adds that, quote, the changes that occur in these contexts are wide-ranging, affecting the film's materiality, narrative, style, genre, meaning, reception, and canonical status, unquote. Films therefore undergo what she calls retrospective cultural consecration, a process through which, quote, films of the past are validated well after their initial play, either in continuity with their original consecration, and that's been the case for a perennial favorite such as the Oscar-winning Casablanca from 1942, or in a belated recognition as the which we see in the seismic critical reassessment of Vertigo, 1958, after its theatrical re-release in 1983. This notion of the canon as a constructed entity is not meant to contest the qualifications of Universal's monster cycle for canonicity or to defend its place in the canon. For what it's worth, I'm a fan of many of these films, but to underscore the roles that agents in the aftermarket play in creating a film's sense of value, which is to say, quote, both what sells the film and what makes it meaningful for the public, unquote. The various home video releases of the Universal monster movies, each literally labeled a classic, offers an explicit example of the process Klinger describes. Between 1991 and 1994, Universal released 37 films from its horror catalog on VHS under the banner of the Classic Collection, chief among them being the 1931 to 1946 monster cycle outlined earlier, sans She-Wolf of London, The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, and the Ape-Woman sequels. In addition, the collection included Universal's Spanish language version of Dracula, 1931, its Edgar Allan Poe cycle, Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1932, The Black Cat, 1934, and The Raven, 1935, the late medieval melodrama Tower of London, 1939, the lesser-known B-level monster movies Man-Made Monster, 1941, and The Mad Ghoul, 1943, and two Paramount horror films to which Universal had acquired the rights, Island of Lost Souls, 1932, and The Monster and the Girl, 1941. Rounding out the collection were the three Gilman films, Creature from the Black Lagoon, 1954, Revenge of the Creature, 1955, and The Creature Walks Among Us, 1956, that came from Universal's science fiction cycle of the 1950s. This retrospective cultural consecration is also a form of generic reclassification, uprooting the Gilman trilogy from its historical location alongside its sci-fi contemporaries, such as It Came from Outer Space, 1953, Tarantula, 1955, This Island Earth, 1955, The Mole People, 1956, and The Deadly Mantis, 1957, all produced by William Allen, and recontextualizing it in an earlier generation of films inspired by 19th century Gothic literature or otherwise characterized by a Gothic visual style. Note that all of these films feature monsters, whether extraterrestrials, mutants, or giant bugs, but only the Gilman had his own series, giving the character a privileged position that Frankenstein's monster, the Dracula family, werewolves, mummies, and invisible men occupied at Universal. That the director of the first two Gilman films, Jack Arnold, also directed It Came from Outer Space and Tarantula, reflects a canonical reorganization subsuming any individual filmmaker under the corporate authorship of Universal Pictures. Subsequent releases contracted and expanded the collection with the introduction of new home video formats. The Classic Monster Collection in 1999 consolidated what we might call Universal's flagship monster movies on both DVD and new VHS editions. Dracula, both the English and Spanish versions, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolf Man, the 1943 version of Phantom of the Opera, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. Universal commissioned Philip Glass to compose a score for the English language Dracula, as this early sound film lacked any underscoring after the opening credits, and the Kronos Quartet performed it for the DVD and new VHS releases. The DVD allowed viewers to choose between playing the film with or without the Glass score. In 2004, Universal released the Legacy Collection on 6 DVD sets, repackaging the flagship monster movies with all of their sequels and thematically related films, e.g., including the Karis series with The Mummy and both Werewolf of London and She-Wolf of London with The Wolfman. The Phantom of the Opera was excluded from the Legacy Collection, presumably because it was a standalone film, but in 2012, when Universal released the Essential Collection on Blu-ray, it brought the Phantom back into the pantheon it was now calling the Universal Classic Monsters. The Essential Collection included digitally restored versions of its 9 flagship films, while the 2018 Blu-ray release of the Universal Classic Monsters Complete 30-Film Collection added all of the sequels and thematically related films that were previously released on DVD in the Legacy Collection. In the years that immediately followed, the rest of the horror films that appeared on VHS in the Classic Collection have been released on Blu-ray through the cult horror label Scream Factory and identified simply as part of the Universal Horror Collection. The boutique label there reclassifying these films as deep cuts for a niche collector's market. Both the Essential and Complete collections contain hours of bonus extras, such as documentaries and expert feature commentaries, as well as collectible booklets about the films' histories. This paratextual apparatus of supplemental material endows the Blu-ray releases with what Klinger describes as event status and cultural significance, serving as a celebratory imperative, that's her term, or, quote, the compulsory affirmation of the saluted object, unquote, that advances the legend of a so-called classic film. In this case, the term legend does not imply, quote, a series of outright falsehoods about the film, but a set of both factual and promotional stories about it, a mix of research and hype that have been repeated so often and in such a celebratory register that they define the popular dimensions of its history and classic standing within a mythic frame, unquote. As recently as 2022, the Universal released the 9 flagship films on 4K UHD in the 2-volume Universal Classic Monsters Icons of Horror collection, showing how celebratory imperatives always adapt to new platforms to keep films and their legends in circulation, as if deeming them important enough to exist in the latest and most prestigious technological formats. Just this month, the complete 8-disc Universal Classic Monsters limited edition collection was released on 4K Blu-ray. The home video releases of Universal's monster movies not only introduced a millennial audience to Frankenstein's monster and company, but also provided sustenance for the monster kids who grew up in the boomer era and first saw these films in their post-premiere circulation. During the 1960s, the most influential exhibition context in framing these films as objects of fan affection was television. For example, during the decline of the old Hollywood studio system in the mid-1950s, studios began selling or leasing their back catalogs of films made before 1948 to television syndicators as one way to collaborate with the potential media competitor. Universal leased 52 films to Columbia Pictures' television subsidiary Screen Gems. The package went into syndication in 1957 under the title Shock Theater and was broadcast in late-night time slots. What would become flagship monster movies such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and The Wolfman were programmed along with Werewolf and She-Wolf of London, the Edgar Allan Poe cycle, 4 of the 5 Inner Sanctum films, and even obscure B-level horror, mystery, and espionage films, indicating the continued flexibility of horror as a genre that had migrated to television. The presence of hosts in horror-themed costumes also shows how by the late 1950s, studio-era horror films were starting to be recognized as sources of nostalgia and camp appreciation. The chart-topping novelty song Monster Mash 1962 would capitalize on this reception condition, with singer-songwriter Bobby Boris Pickett impersonating Karloff as a Frankenstein-type mad scientist who learns a new dance craze from his monster creation and teaches it to the Wolfman Dracula and his son. So successful was the shock theater package in local markets such as New York's WABC, Philadelphia's WCAU, Chicago's WBKB, San Francisco's KRON, and Los Angeles's KTLA that it inspired numerous clones. Screen Gems put a 21-film package into syndication titled Son of Shock the following year, largely consisting of Columbia Pictures horror films and Universal horror sequels, among them Bride of Frankenstein. The rebirth of Universal's monsters on television also created a readership for horror, fantasy, and science fiction fan magazines that had their heyday in the 1960s and 1970s. Famous Monsters of Filmland, Castle of Frankenstein, and Cinefantastique. Later magazines such as Fangoria and Video Watchdog are successors to these formative monster magazines. The earliest of such publications, Famous Monsters, was founded by James Warren and Forrest J. Ackerman and featured painted cover portraits of Universal's monsters, among others, by Basil Gogos, whose lurid color and grotesque detail brought a distinctive stylization to faces of characters that had only been seen in black and white. Running from 1958 to 1983, the magazine contained publicity stills, interviews with surviving stars and production personnel who worked on Universal's monster movies, tributes to those who had recently departed, and mail-order advertising for monster merchandise, including 8mm and 16mm prints of feature films. Famous Monsters helped develop a subcultural canon through a rhetoric of genre connoisseurship addressed to a dedicated growing fan base, as well as the celebratory imperative invested in promoting and maintaining the films as legends. As a magazine, it increased the visibility of Universal's Famous Monsters and literally circulated the iconography that fans associate with their films. The target audience of Famous Monsters was one of adolescent boys, as evidenced by the frequent advertisements for the 98-cent monster models by the plastic kit company Aurora, which acquired the rights to all of Universal Monsters in the 1960s and paid the studio a 3% royalty, eventually 5%, on the sales of the model kits. Frankenstein's monster was released in 1962, and its enormous popularity led to the production of Dracula and the Wolfman by the end of the year. Aurora then released The Gill Man, The Caris Mummy, and Chaney Sr.'s Phantom in 1963. Further still, 1963 saw the release of Quasimodo, whom Chaney Sr. had played in Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1923, another silent era precursor to the studio's monster cycle of the 1930s and 1940s. Sculptor Bill Lemon was responsible for Aurora's Universal monster line and relied on 8x10-inch publicity stills to ensure the accuracies of the likenesses. Universal's monster canon was starting to take shape. Lemon then passed the torch to Raymond Myers, who expanded the line beyond Universal Monsters to include RKO's King Kong and Toho's Godzilla in 1963. In 1965, he also introduced Mr. Hyde from Paramount's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1932, starring Frederick Marsh in the double role. Life magazine estimated that by 1963, Aurora was one of around 30 manufacturers in a new monster industry. Earning a combined profit of $10 million, these manufacturers flooded the market with everything from games and jigsaw puzzles to wind-up and remote control toys, from t-shirts and jewelry to comic books and bubblegum packs with trading cards, from LP records to soap bubbles threatening to scare the dirt away. Aurora alone had reaped the profits of $7.5 million monster kits sold by the beginning of 1964. Soon to join the party would be The Munsters, Universal's sitcom that aired on CBS from 1964 to 1965 about a family whose members resemble Frankenstein's monster, the Werewolf of London, Dracula, and Luna, the female vampire played by Carol Borland in MGM's Mark of the Vampire, 1935. Aurora, Universal, and Famous Monsters seized this moment to sponsor a monster customizing contest in 1964 inviting hobbyists to use any materials of their choice to accessorize their Aurora monster models and enter store contests around the country. 2 Aurora monster customizing kits were released to give participants help getting started. Store winners would then compete on a state level based on photographs of their sets, and state winners sent their accessorized models to Aurora for the company to judge the final rounds. In 1965, Aurora's monster models continued with the Bride of Frankenstein and 2 generic characters, the Witch and the skeletal forgotten prisoner. And in the spirit of accessorizing, all 3 were accompanied by their own diorama settings. With the exception of the Bride, an underseller in an adolescent male fan base, all of the monster models came back on the market in 1969 with Aurora's Frightening Lightning line, which included glow-in-the-dark parts made from phosphorescent plastic. This commercial landscape of serial filmmaking, cross-promotion, and product tie-ins established the conditions for Universal to adapt its monster movie properties for the era of high-concept franchising in the 21st century. In short, the famous monsters have long served as branding mechanisms to promote Universal's legacy as the House of Horrors, a legacy that ascribes significance to them as what we now call the Universal Classic Monsters. As their aesthetics of circulation have helped renew this status at key moments in their afterlives, this status also provides a rationale for further revivals that reinforce the canonicity of the characters and the canonicity of the films. We have seen the full spectrum of commercial success in sequels, remakes, and spin-offs that have followed celebratory imperatives to revisit the original films and expand their storytelling universe. Director Stephen Sommers' 1999 remake of The Mummy starred Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz as 1920s swashbucklers who must save the world after Imhotep, played by Arnold Vosloo, is accidentally awakened. 2 sequels followed in 2001 and 2008, the first of which inspired a spin-off film series focused on Dwayne Johnson's Scorpion King character. A roller coaster called Revenge of the Mummy opened in 2004 at Universal Studios Florida and Universal Studios Hollywood, where the classic monsters have achieved fame as theme park attractions in Universal Orlando's Horror Makeup Show, Universal's Halloween Horror Nights, the Universal Monsters Live Rock and Roll Show, and Universal's House of Horrors Walkthrough Maze. On the other side of the spectrum, there was the critically reviled Van Helsing from 2004, also directed by Stephen Sommers, which took a similar action-adventure approach to The Mummy. The film was to serve as a reboot of the classic monster movies with its reimagined versions of Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Igor, and the Wolfman, not to mention Dracula's Professor Van Helsing himself, played by Hugh Jackman. Not coincidentally, the rollout of the Legacy Collection DVDs was timed to coincide with Van Helsing's May 2004 release. Before the film even opened, Universal began developing a sequel and announced it was greenlighting a television spin-off called Transylvania that would air on ABC in the fall of 2004, planning to use the same sets from the original film. When the studio tallied its domestic box office receipts, $120 million against a budget of $170 million, it decided to cancel the would-be franchise, leaving only a direct-to-video animated prequel, Van Helsing: The London Assignment, and a video game for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance as its residual evidence. The Universal Studios Hollywood walkthrough attraction, Van Helsing: Fortress of Dracula, opened on the film's premiere date, but was replaced by Universal's House of Horrors 2 years later. What the future holds for the UCM remains to be seen, but we can be certain that Universal's monsters will continue rising from their coffins and sarcophagi, awakening with the powers of emergent technologies and transforming under new lights. They are immortal, indestructible, undying, present even when not visible on the screen. Arguably, they have never had as much everyday visibility on the screen as they do right now. Many Universal horror films are available to stream on NBC Universal's Peacock, and a Universal Monsters channel has been added to Amazon's Freevee. Freevee, rather, not Freebie, but it is free. I guess that's why it's called Freevee. For all of the insidious capitalist implications in this cyclical pattern of death and resurrection, one also recalls Dr. Pretorius's often quoted toast to a new world of gods and monsters in The Bride of Frankenstein, and takes insidious pleasure in seeing his vision fully realized. Thank you for coming, and I'll be happy to take any questions or just talk about monsters more generally.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us a fascinating look behind the world of monsters in film. At this time, I'd like to open up the event for questions amongst anyone who has. Please either raise your hand and I will call on you, or enter your question in the chat box and I will read it to Professor Scheibel. All right. Let's see. I could start with a question.
Please.
Okay. Why do you think these classic films and of monsters remain so present in our culture today?
I think it has to do partly with just the continued visibility that Universal keeps kind of rolling them back out. So they're just always around. And so they're constantly being reintroduced to a younger generation. I think it has to do with nostalgia. It seems like every generation had a moment in which it connected with these monsters that originated in the 1930s and 1940s, whether they were people who saw the movies when they first came out, whether they were people who were teenagers in the 1960s and were watching shock theater and reading famous monsters of filmland, whether they were Gen Xers or millennials like myself who were kids when the video releases were coming out. That's when I was first exposed to them. Or whether they're like my students' age now who are seeing the movies brought back in this kind of parodic fashion like Renfield, or in the more kind of straight-faced fashion like Last Voyage of the Demeter. So there's always, unlike a lot of classic films that either haven't been remade or have been sort of embalmed in film history, these films are always being kind of updated to sort of keep up with current tastes and current trends. I think there's a hand from Terry Bell.
Okay. Let's see.
Terry, if I may, I think you're muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Let's see.
I see my friend Eric Grody has a question.
All right. Yep.
Hi, yes. Thanks for this. This is fascinating. I had a question. You mentioned the two sort of failed attempts at rebuilding the world through first Van Helsing and then the more recent Mummy. What didn't come up was something that's almost kind of a new universe that I know you have also thought and written about, which was the Penny Dreadful TV series. Mm-hmm. How does that fall into this, or is that kind of field because it's not specifically a Universal project?
Yeah, that one's kind of an outlier because Universal wasn't involved in that. So it wasn't promoted with the Universal brand the way that the Mummy, for example, if you go back and look at the trailer for the 1999 Mummy, it's very much kind of advertising. The trailer advertises the film as like, the new chapter in this long line of horror filmmaking. So Penny Dreadful was a Showtime Sky Atlantic production. So a lot of the monsters that you see in Penny Dreadful are, they resemble the monsters from literature. So Frankenstein's monster in Penny Dreadful doesn't have the green skin and the flat top and the bolts in his neck. That's Universal's copyrighted look for the Boris Karloff monster. He instead has very pale skin, long, stringy black hair. He's hyper literate as opposed to being sort of monosyllabic like Karloff's monster. And that's because he's meant to remind us of the Mary Shelley creature. There is one major reference to / homage to Universal, and that's with the Wolfman character played by Josh Hartnett. And one of the reasons why that may not have been super obvious to people that was a tie-in with Universal, and the show's pretty old at this point, so I feel like I can kind of spoil this twist. That's something that isn't revealed until later, that Josh Hartnett's character is Wolfman Larry Talbot. So I think because that one is more of a potpourri.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the question, Eric.
I have a question in the chat box, which I will read for you. This is from Aaron Ford. Can you talk about how IP Dracula is owned by Universal, but many have done vampire movies, or could argue that Twilight is the modern version of vampires and werewolves? Is that a challenge for Universal IP's value?
Yeah, that's a great question. Partly when Universal does a vampire movie, there's some kind of direct reference back to Lugosi's Dracula. So with Renfield, I don't know how many people saw Renfield. It didn't do super well critically or commercially, but it has this interesting little prologue that's in black and white, and there's direct reference to the 1931 Lugosi Dracula film. The Last Voyage of the Demeter doesn't reference the Lugosi film. It references the Stoker novel. But in the advertising, it was very much, Universal's Globe logo was all over the posters and the trailers and so forth. The other vampire movies that have kind of sprung up over the years, the Twilight franchise, for example, the Blade movies, to refer to a franchise from my youth, they often aren't self-conscious in their allusions to the Lugosi tradition or the Universal tradition of Dracula. So I don't think it's so much like competition per se. They wouldn't have been able to get away with having a Lugosi-esque vampire, but I do think it's encouraged Universal to find ways to continue updating Dracula so that he doesn't read as like a dated figure to younger audiences. When I show the original Dracula to my students in my monster movies class, for understandable reasons, they find it, somewhat funny, like in this unintentional way, because it has certain dated aspects. So I think rather than doing this completely straight-faced Dracula, they have to either make it ironic and darkly funny, like Renfield, and in that way, it's kind of like the that comedy TV show. Everybody's always telling me to watch it. What We Do in the Shadows, or the Last Voyage of the Demeter is like super, super gory. And I think, and very, very straight-faced, almost like a kind of A24, folk horror film, or, serious prestige horror films, takes itself very seriously. So I think because young people have all these different vampires as points of reference, Universal has to kind of keep up with different vampire trends or different horror trends, rather than just recycling the same old, vampire with the Hungarian accent with the sort of, gentleman appearance. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we have a question from Joan the Artemis, and Joan wants to know, why did you not mention the 1994 film Bram Stoker's Dracula?
Quite simply, it was not a Universal film. So, and that's why they had to call it Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, it's Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, so that there wasn't the sense that it was a remake of the Universal 1931 Dracula, that it's its own distinct thing that is directly adapted from the novel, not a remake of the film. And it's very, I don't know how many people remember it or have seen it, but it's very, very different than the Lugosi film. And it is attempting a kind of fidelity to the source material that the Lugosi film doesn't have.
I have an interesting question from Chris. And Chris wants to know, what comments do you have about Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein? And is there a connection between the 1970s 1970s slasher films and the Universal monster movies?
Sure. So I love Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein. I think it's hilarious. And I think that it's doing something very similar that the Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein movie is doing. It's kind of poking fun at the Frankenstein movies, specifically the Universal movies, because if you remember, Young Frankenstein is actually in black and white long after movies were made in black and white, and there are direct references to the Universal film, specifically lines of dialogue, characters, costumes, even reuses some of the same sets. So it's calling attention to that version of Frankenstein, not others. I mean, it does sort of allude maybe to Hammer and Mary Shelley, but its source of parody its object of parody is the 31 Frankenstein film. But it's also paying homage to it. It's that sort of, parody that's both mocking and also kind of celebratory at the same time. You can tell that Mel Brooks has great affection for the original film, or the original film series. So it's recycling and recirculating a lot of the same imagery from those original films. I learned a lot about the original Frankenstein from actually seeing the Mel Brooks version, not the original version. So it's kind of keeping the memory of the original alive through parody. In terms of the 70s slasher movies, I do consider those monster movies. I actually teach them in my monster movies class, but they're a different kind of monster. There's less of the kind of pathos. With Frankenstein's monster, you sort of feel sorry for him, right? He's sort of misunderstood creature. He didn't ask for this. The Wolfman, same thing. The universal monsters are sympathetic in a way. Whereas the 70s slashers, our allegiance is usually with the babysitter or the camp counselor, the so-called final girl that is the last person standing. So in that way, I think they're quite different.
Okay. I don't see any hands, so I will read another one for you. This is from Aaron Ford. Can you talk about how, excuse me, did I read that one already? I'm sorry. Let's see. We had one from, let's see, Philomena McNamara. How do monster movies generate today differ from the original versions?
Well, in terms of the Universal monster movies specifically, I would say that there is this kind of self-conscious effort to refer back to the originals while also kind of distancing themselves from the originals, so that it doesn't seem like purely nostalgic retread material. So they either take an ironic approach or make them more realistic and more violent, like Last Voyage of the Demeter. In general, I would say, our as a society, our tolerance for gore is much higher now than it would have been in the 1930s and 1940s. So even so-called traditional monster movies are still very gory, much more so in terms of sex and violence, much more explicit than you would see in the past. I think there's still this ambivalence that people have about the horror genre. So a lot of films will position themselves as so-called elevated horror films or art horror films, so that the audience is asked to take this maybe more seriously than they would the average horror film. And as a horror fan, I think that's kind of a snobbish approach. I think, there's nothing to be ashamed of with liking horror and with making horror films. So as much as I have really admired a lot of these, quote unquote art horror films like The Witch, I also think there's a danger in distinguishing those kinds of horror films from everything else, because at the end of the day, they're pretty much telling the same sort of stories with the same kind of characters, but they have a slightly more kind of artistic pedigree. They're maybe influenced by European art cinema, or they have some kind of overt social commentary. So I would say that in terms of where horror is right now, A24, Jordan Peele's company, these kind of art horror films or elevated horror films are in some ways acknowledging the genre, but kind of at an arm's length.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. And Elizabeth Cole wants to know, where are the limits of these classic monsters on us as a society? For example, The Last Voyage of, I can't read that, Demeter, didn't do nearly as well as expected at the box office, even though it's based on Dracula. Does society ever change enough to break the hold of classic Hollywood monsters on us?
Yeah, I think the jury's out on what the future of the Universal monster movies is going to look like. They have these other movies in the pipeline, so I'll be very curious to know, after both Renfield and Last Voyage of the Demeter underperformed both critically and commercially. I think they're hoping that the Bride of Frankenstein remake and the Dracula remake might sort of get the series back on track. The Invisible Man remake showed a lot of promise for the future of the series. That was it was successful at the box office. It was successful with critics. So I think it's probably too early to tell, but as history has shown, these monsters always kind of come back in some other form. So whether they're in an overt way calling our attention back to classical Hollywood, or whether they're sort of reimagined as something very different. You know, we're always going to have Dracula movies. We're always going to have werewolf movies. You know, the Frankenstein's monster is a sort of popular character, even independent of the Universal movies. I mean, he goes all the way back to 1920s theater, 19th century literature. So I think they're always going to be with us, but they'll take different shapes as they, you know, keep coming back to life.
Wow, fantastic. Well, Professor Scheibel, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for so much for joining us this evening. This was a fascinating discussion on a wonderful topic. I'm so happy we had a chance to learn from you today. And thank you all for joining us for this interesting session. Please stay tuned for more invitations for future presentations, and we hope to see you again soon. And we will now close the Zoom meeting. Everyone have a great evening.
Thanks for coming.